Welcome to Building Texas with Justin McKenzie and Summer Babarek. Sponsored by the Boerne Kendall County Economic Development Corporation and Das GreenHaus. And now, here's your host, Justin McKenzie.
Welcome to Building Texas. My name's Justin McKenzie, and you're listening to us on Boerne Radio 103.9 FM. Today, I'm sitting down with Dr. Joe Serio, who has an interesting background that we're going to get through, but involves the Russian Mafia, governmental training. I don't even know where to start. We're going to come back to his book that we'll talk about, but the book is titled Vodka, Hookers, and the Russian Mafia, My Life in Moscow. And I think that's going to relate somehow to how we're building Texas and the work that we're doing here locally. Joe and I met through Manifestive Design in Cali, and I got to spend about an hour with you really after one of your retreats coming down off of that. We had a lot of conversation and thought similarly about how people work and the work-life balance, what they go into. And when we're thinking about first responders that are in these situations, you're helping train them for that particular day, but you're helping them understand how to do that every day and show up in a really unique way. So I'm excited to learn more about your training and how you're taking that entrepreneurial approach into governmental workers.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Great to be here. When I was coming out of my PhD program at Sam Houston State University, I started training probation officers and law enforcement. I was at a law enforcement training one day, and during the break, a dispatcher comes up to me and says, I have to attend these law enforcement trainings because we're the redheaded stepchild of law enforcement and they don't have enough trainings for us. What does that mean? That means market opportunity. There's a niche that needs to be developed. So the first thing I did was start doing sit-alongs in 911 centers. So I spent 100 plus hours listening to calls, talking to dispatchers, interviewing supervisors, and finding out what their world was like. And as it turns out, they are the redheaded stepchild of law enforcement. And they don't have nearly the amount of training or quality training up until a few years ago that other agencies, other divisions had. I decided we should take the experiences I have and the skill set that I have and apply it to dispatch because they're similar things that I learned. On some level, it's universal, right? Stress management, time management, understanding your own fear and resistance, emotional intelligence. That's the whole package that I was bringing. And I brought that to dispatch. Number one, they're amazing people. Number two, they have an impossible job. Number three, they're understaffed. Number four, they're underfunded. So what do you do with that group?
Let's remind our listener to take a step back and think about what is dispatch. Dispatch is the person that's answering the phone when you're in crisis, when you're in probably one of the most stressful positions you've ever been in. You're calling 911. There's a person that hears that ring and picks up the phone, not knowing who's on the other line, what the other line is, but they have a set of protocols, a set of things that they have to go through so that they can initiate, in some cases, hundreds of people moving on your emergency.
There are so many dynamics at play. So you have the person who's calling. That's probably, like you said, the worst day of their life. Mm-hmm. They've got an emergency. They have someone in crisis, someone dying perhaps. And you have everything that's going through their head. That's usually punctuated by fear and panic. Then you have the person on the receiving end. They have their protocols and they start asking questions. And the person who's called in is like, don't ask me questions. Just get me help. And the dispatchers have their reasons, but the caller doesn't understand that world. And what the dispatcher has to do is understand that the caller is probably calling for their first time. And it might be a call that the dispatcher's already heard 10 times that day. And they have to remember that this is a crisis for the caller, no matter how mundane even it's become to the dispatcher.
It's concerning that it becomes mundane to people, and it's a numbing effect. That how do you balance being calloused to being numb? And dispatch is hard, and I've seen it in different corporate experiences where those calls are coming in. The emotional intelligence of, hey, I'm going to leave this at work and not take it home with me. I'm going to leave this at work and not expose my family to the 15 crises that I had today. I think the same with EMTs. They have a sense of humor that's well known throughout the industry because they live in really tough situations every day, and they have to find a way to cope, manage, or work through. And that's what you're bringing.
Yeah. One of the things that we talk about a lot is transitions. Transitions are super important. By transitions, I'm talking about When a dispatcher leaves work and goes home, stay in the car. Stay in the car for 5 minutes before you walk in the house. Consciously realize that the people at home have no idea what you went through. You don't want them to know what you went through. You're not going to come home and tell your kids about this emergency or horrific situation. But you have to remember that you have to be fair to them. So you can't bring all this angst and stress and come home and kick the cat and scream at the kids and just dump it on the people that you're supposed to be closest with in your life. And along with that goes things like health, diet, exercise. Dispatchers are notorious for either not getting or not taking their breaks. You know, that 10, 15 minutes is super important. We also talk a lot about breathing. You can start turning off the stress response and turn on the relaxation response, which was studied by Harvard professors in the 60s and 70s. That 3 deep internal breaths, right? Diaphragmatic breathing. You can do it at a stoplight. You can do it in 1 minute. You can do it in 30 seconds. Starts to help you relax, slows down your heart, reduces cortisol and other hormones coursing through your veins. It's like, wait a second, let me take a second and let me regain control so I can think. That's a critical part, is how do I keep my brain engaged in this situation without freaking out and succumbing to my own fear, panicking, because when we do that neurologically, our IQ goes down. We can't think straight, and we're trying to improve decision making.
Now, you come into this with a level of expertise that you gained through your career. What does that look like? We talked about your book coming out. You spent a lot of time in Moscow, and I thought it was really interesting that you were the only American to work in organized crime control department for the Soviet National Police. Yet you're obviously American, and I'm sure there's a wonderful story on how your family got here, and you're one of 12. Mm-hmm. How does one of 12 Sicilian-American end up in Moscow working for the Soviets, but now back here with me in Texas talking about training?
When I was growing up, I was afraid of everything, which has really helped me a lot right now, because what I'm doing is tapping into other people's fears. And I'm trying to show them that I'm trying to give them permission to give themselves permission to live the life that they want to live instead of being locked down in fear and anger and temper and all the rest of it, right? I grew up in a family of 12, like you said, 11 siblings, and I was afraid of everything. So when it came time to be in college, I had to choose one last class for my course schedule. I had no idea what I was doing. So I opened up the course catalog. This is 1983-ish. I shut my eyes, twirled my finger in the air, put it down on the page, and it landed on a class called Who Are the Soviets? And I took it. It was everything except Russian language. Politics, literature, history is really interesting. And my father said to me, if you want to have any chance of understanding these people, you better start studying Russian right now. And luckily, I was too stupid to understand that that was going to be really hard. So I just dived in and I got totally addicted to it. I went to Moscow, studied for 6 months. I moved to Chicago from New York, worked at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and I worked for a guy who had been a cop in New York City, a detective, a Marine, got his PhD, became the vice chancellor of the University of Illinois, and started setting up relationships all over the world with China, Israel, Egypt. And at that time, he just started interacting with the Soviet Union. So he said, hey, how would you like to go work in Moscow for 4 months with the cops? You're the only one in the office that speaks Russian. Because I ended up studying Russian in college. I went to Moscow and studied Russian language there for 6 months. And I said, no. He said, what? I said, I've watched you. You're a wheeler dealer. So if you send me for a year, I'll do it, but I'm not going for 4 months. He's like, okay, wise guy, go, pack your bags. So he sent me to Moscow, and I worked in the Ministry of Internal Affairs in their national headquarters in Moscow. That was incredible, obviously. At the same time, my boss was sending me to China, so I lived in China for a year in the late 80s and the 90s. Take all that, fast forward, that was not what I wanted to do with my life. I did it because someone said, hey, you want to go to Moscow? And I said, okay, I'll go there. You want to go to China? Go. And I would just say yes to everything because I was too afraid of doing the thing I really wanted to do. And the thing I really wanted to do was write books and speak. As I look back, I just turned 60 years old. As I look back, you kind of look at it and say, ooh, this kind of worked out perfectly because I ran around the world. I worked with law enforcement in the United States. I worked with probation departments. I worked with corrections. I had this experience of multiple cultures organizationally inside the U.S. and just nationwide in Russia, China, England, France. I traveled all over. And the lessons that I could distill is what gives me the influence that I have in the classroom now. because I can take all these lessons and apply it to the audience that's in front of me. And a lot of times it's dispatch, and a lot of times it's law enforcement or government. I work with city councils, I work with mayors, I work with department heads across cities. So all of that material is fodder that we can use in the classroom to help them engage with themselves to make different decisions. And the bottom line for me is this is about culture. When you look at Russia and you look at the United States, different culture, different way of thinking, different way of celebrating, different food, different clothing. It's very distinct. And the question that I have for my clients is, what's the culture of your 911 center? What's the culture of your police department? What's the culture of your town and your city? Have you consciously created a positive culture, or have you just kind of stumbled along and your employees are miserable? And there's a way to do that. And that's what I've learned over the years, and bring all that material from watching 11 siblings and my parents under one roof. That was a fantastic education. And then taking that and watching people in Russia, China, and around the world, and teaching people how to interact, teaching people how to read other people, teaching people to slow down, talk less, watch more, listen a lot, and figure out who you're dealing with so that you can pull the right lever at the right time in the right way to get the outcomes that you're looking for.
You're listening to Building Texas on Boerne Radio 103.9 FM. When we come back from the break, we're going to talk more about the entrepreneurial journey that you went through and the experiences that you had, but I really enjoy your thoughts on culture here as we talk about impacting small teams at a municipal level that are going to make a big impact locally. So when we come back from the break, we'll dive deeper. This is Justin McKenzie from Building Texas. Today's segment is brought to you by GreenHaus. GreenHaus is a business incubator launched here in Boerne to serve our local community. GreenHaus is a place where you can come to grow your idea. Our goal is to make Boerne accessible to people who are looking to grow a business, expand a business, or learn more about what's out there in their community and get involved. Visit us at dasgreenhaus.org or come visit us at 7 Upper Balcones Road, Boerne, Texas. Das GreenHaus. Welcome back to Building Texas on Boerne Radio 103.9 FM. We're visiting with Dr. Joe Serio this morning and really talking about his wonderful experience around the world, getting to know how to work with people of all walks of life and cultures, and then bringing that back, pursuing your entrepreneurial goal of, I want to be a public speaker, I want to be an author, I want to make an impact. Like most entrepreneurial journeys, that doesn't just happen. You had to go through your college experience, your worldly career experience, because to your point in the first half of the show, you live in fear. I talk about the drug of stability, wanting to work for someone versus wanting to work for yourself. That's a real hard balance when you think about the responsibilities you take when you work for yourself. If you have a family and all the other burdens of life in the way of, you've got to provide health insurance, you got to pay your taxes, you got to put food on the table. With a job, you know what to expect every 2 weeks on a paycheck. When you step out on your own, the fear that you talk about really settles in. Mm-hmm. How did you pivot? What was the forcing function that took you from a job and helped you overcome that fear of doing what you want to be doing today?
There's obviously not one single moment. It was a combination of meeting good people and keeping my eyes open. And I would watch these people. Some of them appeared to be fearless. One of them was my supervisor in Moscow. He was a general in the Soviet police. My father passed away when I was 23. I met this general 8 months after my father died. And it turned out that the general had a 17-year-old son who died just around the same time. So we kind of fit into each other's world, almost like kind of poetically, you know. It was a very interesting combination. So I watched him a lot. And he was the kind of guy who colleagues respected him, his political enemies respected him, his employees respected him. And I saw myself situations where he came face to face with gangsters who also respected him. He had a huge reputation, and he was just a solid guy. And I said, oh, that's different. I never saw that at home. Let me make note of what that means, right? And then when I was getting my PhD, I was working at an institute, and my job was to organize conferences and workshops. So I was hiring speakers, I was reading contracts, I was seeing how much they were being paid, I was reading all the evaluations from the programs. And one of the things that my boss, when in my 20s, the gift that he gave me, he forced me to speak. I was that kid. I'll duck out of any public speaking assignment possible. And he forced me to get up and speak in front of audiences. And here's the thing about the entrepreneurial journey, and it's also a life journey. You have to be willing and understand that you're going to fall down. You're going to make mistakes. And then you can transfer that to the idea of training new people to be dispatchers, training government employees, training law enforcement, and knowing that not only are they going to make mistakes, they must. The road to success and excellence goes directly through mistakes and failure. And if you don't allow people to fail, and if you don't allow them to have, own, and learn from their mistakes, then you're not going to grow. And nothing can change under those conditions. And with the world changing as much as it is, and technology and the stressors, my resources are going away. If they slash my budget 40%, I still have to do the job. Where am I going to make up the balance? I'm going to make up the balance in creativity and support and confidence and people skills. They used to call them the soft skills, right? Now they're the essential skills.
But I think it's also the culture. Before we went to the break, you were talking about you're developing culture with these teams, and you're instilling a new culture with a lot of these teams to overcome, to work through whatever those challenges are that these teams are facing. I like that they called it soft skills for a long time. We don't talk about feelings and emotions. We put other names on those things. But you're getting to the core and the root of where does this fear live in an individual. I suspect you say, where does the fear live in the team too? Mm-hmm. Because systems and processes are built historically for control. Now we're seeing corporate mentalities shift and the idea of, hey, let's let them fail because it's going to drive innovation, or it's going to help them feel ownership over what it is they're solving. I've seen that in manufacturing, and I know that's very powerful to get more people involved and to build that culture. How does that translate into the work that you're doing with dispatch and other governmental agencies?
Yes, all the things that we've talked about so far are interconnected, right? Fear, emotional intelligence, time management, self-management, culture, the guiding principles that we set for our organizations and the values that we set. And if one of the values is being safe, and I mean that in a not facing fear, not trying, not experimenting, then nothing new is going to happen really. One of the great things, if you read the history of discoveries, what is it that one through line that we see in all these histories? A lot of incredible inventions happen by accident. So if you don't allow people to experiment, if you don't allow them to ask questions, if you don't allow them to be themselves, how are they going to show up? They're going to show up angry. They're going to show up annoyed. They're going to show up uncooperative, right? So the approach that I take with any group is the idea that no organization can change. How can an organization change if no individuals inside that organization change? So one thing that happens, especially in my 6-month leadership academy, is that the participants say, I feel like I'm in therapy. It's like, yeah, I want you to feel like you're in therapy because I want you to dig in to understand how you've kept yourself stuck on a personal and individual level. And then understand how you bring that stuckness into your organization and how you react. You can either react or you can respond. And most people react because they're working out of that headspace that they've always been working out of. If you don't like the outcomes that you're getting as an organization, and if you don't like the outcomes that you're getting as a person, something has to change.
But those are the transformational results that you're seeing with your teams is because you're getting deep.
Yes.
And you're really helping them address an issue. I suspect it's fun to see somebody go into your training and then come out of your training. And you're talking about them addressing fears that they've lived with since they were 5, 6, 7 years old. Mm-hmm. And really just taking ownership of it.
Yeah, and it's scary. What's incumbent on me is to create an environment that's safe. You know, some people can dismiss this idea of being safe. Like, I need a safe space. But there's a realness to psychological safety. Because if you're not safe, you're not going to talk. You're not going to share. You're not going to experiment. You're not going to offer ideas. You're not going to do any of those things. If I know or feel or believe that someone's going to make fun of me for talking, I won't talk. So how can we get psychological safety, first of all, inside themselves? So I'll give you 4 quick questions that I use with almost any audience. The questions are, who am I? What do I want? how am I going to get it? And those three questions you ask as specifically, right? You answer them as specifically as possible with as much detail as possible. And then the fourth question is, how am I lying to myself? Called the killer question. Because then you have to face it and say, yeah, I want to lose weight, but I eat ice cream 5 times a week. It's like, well, how are we kidding ourselves here? The program 6-month academy I did recently, I asked those 4 questions in the first of the 6 modules. And a woman came up to me a couple months later and she said, when you said, how am I lying to myself? Alarm bells went off in my mind like crazy. And between module 1 and module 3, which is we meet every month, right? So 2-month period, she lost 20 pounds. Between module 3 and module 5, she lost 20 pounds. By the end of the program, she had lost 45 pounds. She had an accountability partner, which is another critical moment in this, who was her mother. They cooked together, they walked together. Her mother lost 50 pounds. What do you think she's thinking about her life now? What do you think she's thinking about the question, what's possible? That's a question for all companies, for all organizations, and all individuals. That's what we want to know. What's possible? What can I have for my life if I work for the city of Boerne for 20 years, for 30 years? What will I have for a life? What will I have at the end? Can I look back and say, I'm really proud of myself and I had a life that was worth living? But the baggage frequently gets in the way and we stop ourselves. And that's what happened with me. And it took me 5 years just to get past the idea of writing my first book. Not to write it, just to get past the fear of putting my name on a cover and exposing myself to the world and opening myself to criticism. But once I broke that dam, the book started. I've written, edited, translated close to 20 books. And once you realize your friends don't leave you, you don't get new friends, your family doesn't hate you. And it's like, no, you just go do your thing. Except it's the hardest thing in the world to give yourself permission to be yourself.
So when you look at that, and I appreciate everything you're saying there, but how does an organization create the environment for that transformational change? Because you're talking about an individual really getting deep down into themselves and saying, I'm making that change, I'm overcoming this fear. But when you talk about a department, the culture of that full team prevents somebody from finding that, promotes somebody finding that. Mm-hmm. It can be really sensitive to an individual's state of mind because we spend so much time at work. We spend time with these people that if you don't have a place to have, and 911 dispatch is a good example because where is the place that you would go talk about this horrendous thing that you just went through? And it's not at home. And I have a big heart for volunteer fire because they're first responders to tragic things and they don't have the professional training as an example here or the outlet or the resources. And I appreciate you saying safe space and giving it some level of humor that, yeah, it's a big culture thing across the country right now. They're saying it, but they're really misrepresenting what you're talking about.
So to answer the question, the place that we start, if we're working with an organization on an ongoing basis, the place we start, number 1 is leadership, and number 2, talking to each other. We got to get the leadership sorted out first. And so one of the things that I've done over time is learn how to read people and learn how to get people to understand each other. So I do leadership retreats for department heads, mayor, chief of police, head of public works, head of HR, economic development. We get them all in the same room together. And then we talk through things. Secondly, you have to involve a conversation about values and what this organization wants to be. And you have to include the people. And what ultimately happens is we identified who do we want to be. You want to be procedural and process and legislative and all statutory, and that's the organization you want? Great. And if I want a people-driven organization and I want people to support and I want to celebrate and I want to have that binding, I have to now go find somebody who wants to live that life. So if you think about culture, you think about values, and once you've identified that, you have to now infuse it into how I write my job announcement, how I do my job posting, how I write my interview questions, how I do my onboarding, how the trainer understands our values, and how they're going to communicate culture to their trainee, and top to bottom, inside and out.
My hope as we wrap up the conversation is that municipalities, counties, all of these organizations really lean into taking ownership because we are growing. You can't fight it. Everywhere out here is growing. We need best in class sitting in all of those departments. And when we're intentional and designing the culture around that individual being successful, any individual being successful, My hope is organizations, whether it's a city, county, or a company, are attracting the people that want to be there, that want to serve in that role. And it's not just a job. It really becomes their purpose. It really becomes them living into their bigger goals in their career. And that wasn't the reality 50 years ago. The labor market was, you got a job and you're going to do this for this much an hour. Now people have choices. It's a very competitive market. And for us to continue to maintain service, whether you're in Real County or Bexar County, we need the best people sitting there taking those 911 calls. And we need an environment that allows them to be their best self when they're doing it.
Yeah, I live in Hutto, Texas, outside Austin, near Georgetown, Round Rock, and that town is growing like mad. So how do you keep up? How can any town keep up with all that growth without actually transforming themselves? Because as a town of 1,000, you can't behave the same way as you do with a 35,000 population. And so there has to be some kind of foundation that you're working from. And that the values are basically the same across the board, but the way you do them might be a little different.
Well, Dr. Joe Serio, thank you for spending time with us today, and thank you for the way that you're building Texas.
Thank you so much.
Children's Story Time. As the Patrick Heath Library is open today from 10 to 4, this is Boerne Radio.